In May of 2014, two of the most watched men on earth stood a few feet apart in Jerusalem, and in front of the cameras, they started to argue. One of them was Pope Francis, the other was Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. The disagreement lasted maybe 10 seconds. It was polite. It was almost playful. And it was about a man who had been dead for nearly 2,000 years. Welcoming the Pope, the Prime Minister said that Jesus had lived in this land, and that he spoke Hebrew. The Pope smiled, leaned forward, and corrected him with a single word: Aramaic. There was a pause. Then Netanyahu offered a compromise. He spoke Aramaic, he said, but he knew Hebrew. Two world leaders, a wall of cameras, and a 2,000-year-old question that neither of them had time to actually settle, because the honest answer is stranger and far more interesting than either version. Here's the puzzle. Jesus of Nazareth is probably the most quoted human being in history. Billions of people can recite his words from memory. Blessed are the meek, Father, forgive them. Love your neighbor as yourself. And yet almost no one alive has ever heard those words in the language he actually said them in. Every red-letter Bible ever printed is a translation. The Gospels themselves, the earliest records of his voice that we possess, were written in Greek, which means that somewhere between his mouth and our page, every single sentence crossed a language barrier. So here's the question we are going to follow all the way down. When Jesus opened his mouth in a village in Galilee, to teach, to argue, to comfort, to pray, what actually came out? Hebrew, the ancient language of Scripture? Greek, the international language of the Roman East? Or Aramaic, a language most people today could not place on a map? This is not a trick question with a one-word answer. This is not a controversy invented by modern skeptics. And this is not a detail that only matters to linguists. It is a real historical puzzle, one that serious scholars have worked on for centuries. And the evidence, when you lay it out piece by piece, reveals something remarkable about the world Jesus lived in. And maybe something even more remarkable about the man himself. One more thing before we start. There is a piece of evidence we are going to save for the very end. 4 words, cried out at the darkest moment of the entire story. Words so unexpected that the people standing closest to the cross misunderstood them. Hold on to that detail. We will need it later. Because those 4 words may be the nearest thing we will ever have to a recording of Jesus' actual voice. The first clue is sitting in plain sight inside the text itself. The 4 Gospels were written in Greek, the common Greek of the first century Mediterranean, the kind a merchant in Alexandria or a soldier in Antioch could read. But scattered through that Greek text, something odd keeps happening. Foreign words break the surface. In the 5th chapter of Mark, Jesus takes the hand of a dead girl, the daughter of a synagogue leader named Jairus, and says, Talitha koum. Mark immediately translates it for his readers, little girl, get up, because he knows they will not understand it. 2 chapters later, Jesus heals a deaf man and says, Ephphatha, be opened. In the Garden of Gethsemane, on the last night of his life, he prays with a word no Greek reader would know. Abba, Father. Those words are not Greek, they are Aramaic. And notice what kind of moments they are. A dead child brought back, a locked body opened, a man face down in the dark praying not to die. These are not random vocabulary samples. They are the moments an eyewitness never forgets. And it looks very much like the sound of them was passed down intact, embedded like fossils in the Greek, because the memory of how the words sounded mattered to the people who were there. The names in the story point the same direction. Jesus calls Simon by a new name, Sepphoris, from the Aramaic kepha, a rock. He nicknames the sons of Zebedee Boanerges, sons of thunder. The place of execution is Golgotha, an Aramaic form meaning place of the skull. Even Gethsemane is Semitic, an oil press. The entire landscape of the story speaks Aramaic, so, case closed, the Pope wins in the first round? But here's where it gets strange. In the 4th chapter of Luke, Jesus comes home to Nazareth and walks into the synagogue on the Sabbath, as Luke says was his custom. He stands up to read. He is handed the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. He finds his place in the scroll, reads the passage aloud, rolls it up, and sits down to teach. Now, synagogue scrolls were not written in Aramaic. They were written in Hebrew. And Hebrew and Aramaic are sisters, not twins. closely related but distinct languages, roughly the way Spanish and Portuguese are. A speaker of one cannot simply read the other. So Luke is showing us a village tradesman who could locate a specific passage in a Hebrew scroll without vowel markings and read it aloud in front of people who had known him since childhood. That is a skill. Someone taught him that. And the Gospel of John adds a third layer. When Jesus is executed, Pilate has a placard fixed above the cross, stating the charge. John notes, almost in passing, that it was written out 3 times, in the local Semitic tongue, in Latin, and in Greek. Stop and think about what that means. Even a Roman execution notice in Jerusalem had to be trilingual, or somebody in the crowd would not be able to read it. This was a 3-fold language world. The second clue is buried in the words for the languages themselves, and this is the part almost everyone misses. When John says something was written or said in Hebrew, he uses the Greek word Hebraisti. But watch what he attaches it to. He gives us the Hebrew name of the judgment pavement, Gabbatha, and the Hebrew name of the execution site, Golgotha. Both of those forms are Aramaic. In other words, first-century writers often said Hebrew when they meant the language the Hebrews currently spoke, which for most of them was Aramaic. The historian Josephus does the same thing. So when an ancient source tells us someone spoke Hebrew, it can mean either language. The line the Pope and the Prime Minister were arguing across was blurry 2,000 years ago. How did that happen? How did Jewish Galilee end up with a mother tongue that is not the language of Moses? The answer, in one word, is empire. Aramaic began as the language of ancient Syria, and the Assyrian and then Persian empires adopted it as their administrative language until it was used from Egypt to the edge of India. When the Judean exiles came home from Babylon in the 6th and 5th centuries before Christ, they came home speaking it. The book of Nehemiah describes Ezra reading the law aloud to the returned exiles, while the Levites gave the sense. And many scholars read that phrase as live translation, Hebrew scripture explained in Aramaic, because the crowd could no longer follow the original. Whatever the exact picture, the long-term outcome is not in dispute. Hebrew became the language of scripture, worship, and scholarship. Aramaic became the language of the street, the workshop, and the kitchen, and Galilean Aramaic came with something extra, an accent. On the night of Jesus' arrest, Peter is standing in a courtyard in Jerusalem, trying to blend in, and the bystanders catch him anyway. "Surely you are one of them," they say in Matthew's Gospel. "Your accent gives you away." Centuries later, the rabbis of the Talmud were still joking about how Galileans mangled their guttural sounds so badly, one story claims, that a Galilean in the market could not make himself understood, asking for something as simple as a donkey. The mockery tells us something the Gospels never state directly. Jesus did not merely speak Aramaic. He almost certainly spoke it with a northern rural accent, the kind of accent that made Jerusalem's fisticates smile before he had finished his first sentence. So let's stop and take stock, because the puzzle has grown. We have a man whose mother tongue looks Aramaic, who could read classical Hebrew from a scroll, living under an empire that posted its signs in Greek and Latin. Which of these did he actually use? And when? That is exactly where the investigation goes next. If you enjoy following evidence like this, the text, the languages under the text, the archaeology under both, this channel is where I do it, one question at a time. Subscribing costs nothing, and it tells me you want more investigations like this one. Now, back to the 1st century. Because now it is time to call an outside witness, someone who actually lived in that world and, remarkably, left us a comment about this exact subject. His name is Flavius Josephus. Born in Jerusalem in the year 37, within a few years of the crucifixion, he was an aristocrat and a priest, educated as well as his society could educate anyone. He commanded forces in Galilee during the Great Revolt against Rome, was captured, changed sides, and ended his life in Rome, writing history books we still read today. And here is the detail that matters for us. When Josephus wrote his first book, an account of the Jewish war, he tells us he composed it first in his native tongue for the Jews living beyond the Euphrates, that is, in Aramaic, and only afterward produced a Greek edition. For the Greek, he admits he needed help. And near the end of his last great work, he makes a confession historians have puzzled over ever since. He says he labored to learn Greek grammar and literature, but that his own pronunciation never became truly clean, because his people did not prize the mastery of foreign languages. Sit with that for a moment. Here is a wealthy, tutored, aristocratic priest telling us that even for him, polished Greek was a lifelong struggle, and that his culture did not particularly reward the effort. If that was true at the top of Judean society, what does it suggest about a builder's family from a Galilean village? But do not close the door on Greek too quickly. Now, watch what happens when you look closer at the map. Nazareth was a small place, but it was not remote. 4 miles away, about an hour's walk over the ridge, stood Sepphoris, a wealthy Greek-speaking city that was being rebuilt on a grand scale throughout Jesus' childhood and youth. Mark's gospel calls Jesus a tekton, a builder, a craftsman in wood and stone. Some historians have suggested that a tradesman from Nazareth could well have worked in Sepphoris, taking his labor to where the money was. That is an inference, not a fact. The Gospels never mention the city. But the geography alone tells us Greek was not some distant imperial abstraction. It was audible from the next hilltop. And the Gospels quietly showed Jesus in conversation with people who almost certainly did not speak Aramaic. A Roman governor at his trial, a centurion whose servant was sick, a Greek woman from the region of Tyre whom Mark explicitly identifies as a foreigner, Greek-speaking pilgrims at a festival asking to meet him. In none of these scenes does an interpreter appear. Now, silence is not proof. The Gospel writers had no reason to mention an interpreter, even if one stood there. But the pattern is at least suggestive. A working tradesman from a bilingual region could plausibly carry on simple business in Greek, the way market vendors in border towns have done in every century since. There is one more ancient voice worth hearing. Around the beginning of the 2nd century, a church leader named Papias wrote that the Apostle Matthew had first collected the sayings of Jesus in the Hebrew dialect, and that others then translated them as best they could. Scholars have argued for generations about what exactly Papias meant, whether Hebrew or Aramaic or something else entirely, and whether he was even correctly informed. That debate is real and unresolved, but notice the assumption underneath his sentence. A Christian writer living within living memory of the apostles took it for granted that the words of Jesus had started out in a Semitic language and had to be translated to reach the wider world. And here, before we go further, is something that needs to be said plainly. We have no recording of Jesus' voice. We have not one sentence written in his own hand. The only time the Gospels ever show him writing anything, he writes with his finger, in the dust of a courtyard. And the wind took it. Everything we can say about the language he spoke is inference, careful inference, built from texts and inscriptions and archaeology, but inference all the same. We do not know for certain, and anyone who tells you they are certain is selling something. This is not a question the Gospels ever answer directly. This is not a truth that some institution locked away. And this is not a case that archaeology has closed once and for all. It is a question we answer by weighing evidence. And in the 20th century, the weight on the scale suddenly, dramatically shifted. Because then, the archaeology changed everything. In the winter of 1947, a Bedouin shepherd near the Dead Sea threw a stone into a cave and heard pottery shatter. Inside the jars were scrolls, the first of what we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls, nearly 1,000 manuscripts that had lain sealed in the desert since around the time of Jesus. And the languages of those scrolls quietly rewrote the debate. Before 1947, some scholars argued that Hebrew was effectively a dead language in Jesus' day, confined to the synagogue the way Latin was once confined to the Mass. The scrolls ended that idea. The majority of them are in Hebrew, and not just copied scripture, but new compositions, rules, hymns, commentaries, written in a living, evolving Hebrew. Beside them lay works in Aramaic, including an Aramaic translation of the Book of Job, which tells you some readers needed the translation. And beside those, fragments in Greek, 3 languages side by side in one desert library. Then, in 1960 and 1961, the Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin rappelled into a cliffside cave above a canyon called Nahal Haver and found the wartime letters of Simon Bar Kokhba, the leader of the last great Jewish revolt against Rome, written about a century after the crucifixion. These are not sacred texts, they are field dispatches, supply orders, complaints, threats to subordinates. And they come in Hebrew, in Aramaic and in Greek, apparently depending on who was writing and who needed to read it. One of the Greek letters even seems to contain an apology for being written in Greek rather than in Hebrew, though the papyrus is damaged at the crucial line, and scholars still argue over its exact reading. Slop channels would tell you that line is a smoking gun. The truth is better. It is a keyhole. Through it, we glimpse ordinary people in ancient Judea doing exactly what the rest of the evidence implies, juggling three languages not as scholars, but as a fact of daily life. Lay all the clues on the table now, and they converge on a clear picture. A man of Jesus' time, place, and trade would carry three languages in three different pockets. Aramaic in the deepest pocket, the mother tongue, the language of home, of parables told to farmers, of nicknames for friends. Scholars who retranslate the sayings of Jesus back into Galilean Aramaic keep finding wordplay and rhythm that the Greek flattens, which is exactly what you would expect if Aramaic was the language he composed in. Hebrew in the second pocket, the language of the scroll, learned in the synagogue, read aloud on the Sabbath, quoted in debate with scribes. And Greek in the third pocket, the language of the market and the garrison, used when the customer or the governor required it. Latin, for what it is worth, was almost certainly not in the picture beyond loanwords every subject of Rome knew: legion, denarius, praetorium. Which brings us back at last to those 4 words. 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the day of the crucifixion. Mark tells us darkness had covered the land for 3 hours. And then Jesus cries out in a loud voice. And Mark, writing in Greek for Greek readers, does something he reserves for the most unforgettable moments. He records the actual sound. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus is quoting scripture, the opening line of the 22nd Psalm. But here's the detail that changes everything. In the Hebrew of the scroll, that line reads, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is not what Mark records. The word Mark preserves, sabachthani, comes from shabach, an Aramaic verb. This is not the wording of the synagogue scroll. It is the wording of an Aramaic rendering, scripture as it lived in the mouth of a Galilean household. At the worst moment of his life, quoting the psalm he had known since childhood, the words came out not in the scholar's Hebrew, but in his mother tongue. Anyone who has lived between 2 languages knows exactly what that is. Ask any immigrant family. You can spend 40 years working in your second language, but pain sends you home. The language you suffer in is the language your mother comforted you in. And the crowd's reaction seals it. Bystanders hear Eloi and think he is calling for Eliyahu, the prophet Elijah. Listen, they say, he's calling Elijah. Many scholars point out that this little misunderstanding is the kind of detail nobody needed to invent. A real cry, misheard in real time, preserved precisely because it was remembered. So the Pope was right. And so, in the end, was the Prime Minister. He spoke Aramaic, he knew Hebrew, and he lived his whole life within earshot of Greek. 3 things worth carrying out of this investigation. First, the finding. The combined weight of the text, the languages beneath the text, the ancient witnesses, and the archaeology points one way. Jesus' daily language was Galilean Aramaic. Spoken with a recognizable northern accent, he could read the Hebrew of Scripture, and he plausibly handled simple Greek when life demanded it. Not one language, a layered 3. Second, the limit. Plausibly is doing honest work in that sentence. We cannot prove how fluent his Greek was, or how deep his Hebrew learning went. The evidence supports probabilities, not certainties, and a channel that pretends otherwise is not investigating. It is performing. Third, and this is the one that stays with me, every Christian on earth today encounters Jesus in translation, and it turns out that has been true since the very first page. The Gospels are already a translation of him. His words crossed a language barrier before they ever reached parchment. And yet, here and there, the people who loved him refused to translate everything. They kept Abba. They kept Talitha koum. They kept the cry from the cross. Whatever you believe about the man, something in that refusal is deeply human. Some things survive translation, and some things were never translated at all, because the people who heard them could not bring themselves to let go of the sound. So now I want to hear from you. Which piece of evidence surprised you most? The trilingual sign over the cross, Josephus struggling with his Greek, or that Aramaic cry hiding inside a Hebrew psalm? And do you think Jesus spoke Greek with Pilate at his trial? Or was there an interpreter standing just outside the story? Put your theory in the comments. I read every one. If this kind of investigation is your kind of history, the next mystery is already waiting on your screen. I'll see you there.